a lot of people that are paying lip service to shared espoused ideals. We get together, we say, we're going to try and do this thing, and whether that's the early stages of Game B, 5-10 years ago, right? Or whether it's any of the movements right now on, future-proofing the world. You get a large group of people together, they all think they're on a shared mission, you start getting the error messages, you start seeing shadow from shadow, you start increasing doubt and decreasing trust, and what do people do? They typically just shrink their sphere of concern. They create break-offs, right? And actually Daniel, I think, mentions that in some of his other descriptions of group information ecology. You create factions and defections, right? Splintering, withholding of information, and basically intuitively, while it feels shitty and it feels like backstabby tribal politics quite often, as we live through those things, it's actually a rational movement, which is, oh shit, if we can't get there with all of us, because we can't trust all of us to know how, right, and to play well, then the very natural thing for me to do is shrink my sphere to the people I do still have trust with and do think we can cohere with, until you get smaller and smaller. But obviously that's antithetical to any of our hopes and sense of urgency about scaling this thing. So step one is just to identify, are we, right, valuing exclusivity, right, whatever it takes to get the high hard goal done, or do we privilege inclusivity, right? And then in the polarities mapping model, there's basically saying identify the upsides of what can happen if we do get it right, but also identify the downsides. What happens if we over-index to this pole and we start seeing the negatives? Right? So for exclusivity, right, it would be that it's a small, agile group of people, they're deeply skilled, there's very little clutter or distraction, and we actually get there. We get to coherence, and we get to coherence in a high trust, low friction framework. Fantastic. But the downside of exclusivity is you leave a lot of people on the sidelines, right? It can create resentment, it can create blowback, very difficult to scale, and often ends up being sort of tops-down dissemination, right? Which is, potentially, overtly hierarchic or exclusive. Got it, right? Well, let's take a look at what happens. What are the good things of inclusivity? Everybody has a seat at the table. There's a diversity of voices. There's an inclusion of former outgroups, right? There's a heterodox nature to our meaning making and sense making together, right? And there's a sense of this actually just, more closely matches our humanitarian values in the first place. What are the downsides? Well, we're all acutely aware of the downsides of, pathological inclusion, which is that any singular voice can hijack the thread. It's very difficult. It's sort of like a hippie drum circle, versus a master djembe player, right? You just get noodly mud. Things take an awfully long time, quite often, to get to consensus. Consensus is fragile and can be firebombed by anybody playing an SJW card or any other kind of agitator, victim, drama triangle kind of dynamics. And because we value inclusivity, we are obligated to stop the presses when anyone says, help, help, I'm being oppressed, right? And so the ability to weaponize cult of sensitivity, nonviolent communication, and all those things is abundant. And when you have narcissists or sociopaths or just, chatty Cathys and needy Neds infiltrate those scenes, and they often do, then it never gets off the ground. So the question is, how do we steer between those? And I think that's, so a couple of examples of that. My sense is obviously, is there a both and? Is there a way that we can acknowledge this is hard, it's subtle and nuanced, and it actually requires a surprising amount of skill and facility, and even the ability to drop ego. Right, Gavin? I think, as you've explored the difference between the IDW, the intellectual dark web, and what were the tenor and flavors of some of those conversations versus more of these kind of emerging conversations, I would sense, one of them is rational, separate egos slinging right thoughts constructs at each other versus people looking and listening to play jazz, right? And so you can make a kid, there's almost that watershed moment. So how might we have the best of both of these things? High and hard are rare for now, and we're going to need a vanguard. And on the other hand, all of us or none of us, it's really critical that we find ways to help this propagate.